Yeah.
Do you feel pretty comfortable that the quarterback of the future could be here in Indianapolis for the Raiders?
I think it's a possibility. There's a lot more work to be done, to be honest with you, to really like say, yeah, I'm confident. Um, where we're at now in the process is we've watched a lot of film on the players, and that's important to get an idea of what the value of the player is. It's a really important part of the process. That position in particular, there's such an emphasis that we put on the neck up and what that is and what that looks like and what it means and how it translates. And you can't get that part off the film. You can get an idea, a little bit of, you can see decision making and processing, and there's an element of it. It's not that it's zero, but until you get in the room with the guy, get him on the board, eventually I would say like work through installs and see how they can retain information. I mean, this is like the first step of that puzzle, to do that, whether then there's the pro day, then there's 30 visits, and you can do private visits and things of that nature. And so I think there's some really talented young players here. And I think there's some years where there's maybe one or two. I think there's, it looks like there's, a handful of guys that have shown on film to be talented, to be diverse in their skill set. And so that's exciting. And then we got to go through the next part of the process to really, I'd say, determine that.
How does what they're doing in college football kind of challenge the NFL in terms of evaluation, especially with what they're doing offensively compared to what you guys are doing offensively?
Yeah, it makes there's definitely a challenge there. We've seen a lot of people overcome it, at this point. So I'd say like there's probably less, maybe less reservations, but there's the element of just, from the basic, taking a snap under center. And there's a difference when you're taking the snap under center and you're backpedaling, if you will, and processing and making a decision versus just standing there in the shotgun and seeing the ball. There's a difference there. But we've seen a lot of people overcome that, and we've also seen offenses have adapted to that too. You don't get a lot of guys under center in certain situations that aren't comfortable with it. The defenses are different. There's definitely a more complex, I'd say, defensive schematic game at the NFL level, and so again, that goes just into someone's ability to learn, someone's work ethic. And do they have the tools, and I'd say both from a personal and a mental skill set to put the work in to learn it. I think what we've seen now is like you can, a guy like Lamar Jackson. Now Lamar Jackson was super talented. He was a Heisman Trophy winner, obviously, but like he's come in the league, and Lamar Jackson can play quarterback in the league, and there's plenty of other guys, along those lines. And so, I think it's difficult because you have to put the work in to determine all that, and you're not going to still have like it's solid, but I think a lot of guys have shown like they can overcome that now.
Specifically with the first round, obviously you guys didn't have one last year. What sort of goes into the process when you're determining, hey, do we want to try to move up? Do we stay here? Do we trade back? I know it's fluid depending on what happens on draft night, but what's sort of the just general thought process when it comes to that approach?
Yeah, I think, in both approaches, on a very basic level, you have to have, to trade up for, specifically, you have to have, obviously, like there's someone that you want to go do that for. And then, you have to weigh the cost of doing business to do that, And so I think what you really have to weigh in those situations is how you value the player and the cost that it's going to take to get that player. Because once you move up, typically you're subtracting other draft picks, which are other players. And so you got to that's the thing that you have to weigh between those two things. In terms of moving back, and we moved back a couple times, I believe, last year, and we moved up a couple times also. But in terms of moving back, it's usually when you're in a draft spot, can be anywhere from maybe 2 to 4 players that you feel really comfortable taking at that spot. And so I think the moving back portion is you get to that point, someone's calling up and you're looking like, hey, we're going to get one of these 4 players or one of these 3 players if we move back 3 slots per se. Do you know what I mean? And so you're kind of just, you're evaluating the risk reward and the gamble of those players, that pool of players being there if you move back. And there's a lot of, I'd say, intelligence that goes into figuring trying to answer those questions based on what what you feel the needs of other teams are, things that you've learned about maybe, you know, what the direction other teams are going to go. And so you try to have some insight beyond just, you know, your gut in those situations. But I think that's the kind of the dichotomy there of those two decisions that you have to weigh.
How do you balance the patience and diligence needed to find a future quarterback with the desire to win now?
Yeah. I think that you have to, when you're looking at, you know, the desire to win now and a future quarterback, it's interesting because we've seen it go both ways in terms of you draft a young guy and they sit, right? Like Mahomes sat for a year, you know, and you can go back to, it was probably a little bit more prevalent. You know, I think even Carson Palmer might have sat for 2 years. And so there's that, there's a history there of doing that and players having success. And there's also the history of guys getting thrown in the fire right away and it not working out so well. Now there's some guys that have gotten thrown in the fire and, you know, taken their lumps and grown. Andrew Luck, I think he led the league in interceptions his rookie year and also went through. And so, yeah, in terms of, to your question, balancing that decision right off winning now, I think it's just a philosophical thing that you have to make a decision on, and you have to be aligned from the top of the organization down. If you draft a young guy and you're going to commit to that person sitting all year and learning, everybody, I think you just have to have that communication on the front end, because there might be some things to stomach. Do you know what I mean? Or, you know, again, that pressure to get that guy out there and throw him in the fire. So it does take, I would say, a unique amount of discipline to do that. But I think more importantly, it has to be alignment, like from the get-go on a situation like that.
And you guys have that already? You guys have discussed that possibility or not yet? Right?
Yeah, no, I think, you know, Josh and I have discussed like kind of what, you know, our, you know, philosophically what, you know, we would like our approach to be on that. There's still more work to be done for me to say, yeah, this is what we're going to do 100%. I'd say we're not there. Of course, we've had those discussions. We've had those discussions over the years. But there is a moment in time here as we're approaching this next phase of the offseason where you have to just make the commitment to what you're going to do if you end up doing that.
Right. Yeah. When you say, you know, throwing somebody in the fire, sometimes when you get a high draft pick at quarterback, you kind of, because the team was bad, that's why they're drafting so high. Mm-hmm. And maybe the offensive support's not going to be there. But in your case, when you look at, you know, if Josh Jacobs comes back, Darren Waller, Hunter Renfrow, Devontae Adams, that's a pretty good setup for any quarterback. Do you feel like that's conducive to a young quarterback maybe stepping in and having some success as a result, where you're not just throwing them into the fire, there's a lot of support there for them?
Yeah, I would say if you were just looking at the support part of that, you would say, yeah, there's a lot of support there for someone to succeed. I think it really ends up being an individual case-by-case thing, because it really depends on the person and what they're ready for. Because if they're not ready to take advantage of all those weapons, because they're not ready for the responsibilities of being an NFL quarterback, then the weapons are null and void. And so in theory, yes, there's a lot of weapons there. But I think, it comes back to the individual and what they're ready for.
Devontae's been pretty, very supportive of you and Josh, but said he wants to be kept in the loop. It's important to him. Obviously, you're not going to let him pick the next quarterback, but how much conversation do you have? Hey, this is a guy we believe when that time comes, that your plan is. How much do you include him in it?
Yeah, well, every relationship's kind of unique. I would say for myself, and I won't speak for Josh, but for myself, Devontae's probably one of, me and him probably have one of the closest relationships that I've had with a player as an active player that's still playing in the NFL. And so, our communication's pretty fluid. Whether it's on the quarterback or whether it's just in general conversation. And so Devontae, we've talked about it before, he's earned the right to be kept in that loop. Josh and I feel that way by what he's accomplished and who he is as a player and who he is as a leader on that team. And so he'll be involved in those conversations, like you said, and Devontae knows he's not selecting who the quarterback is. But he'll be involved in the process, and we'll bounce some ideas off him, and ultimately, again, it's going to be the decision that we're going to make, and he understands and respects that at the same time.
You mentioned the price of doing business. Last year when you made the move for Devontae, you just gave a first and a second last year, and it was done. What's the philosophy going into thinking about draft picks that come from other years? If you have to include that in a move, is it worth the player, or is it just player-to-player basis?
Yeah, I think it's player-to-player basis. there's always when you're working through the draft. I always find it's the future pick doesn't always seem sexy at the time until you get to the next year, and then you're glad that you have that future pick. That's kind of that's the feeling oftentimes that you go through when you're in that moment. I think at the end of the day, it is based on the player, and again, it's like what you determine the value of the player as. And so, like just like with the Devontae trade, we determined that the value, we were okay with his value of being a first and second round pick, and so we made the decision and went with it, and we never looked back, and we're happy with the decision that we made. And so I think that's what you have to evaluate. What's the value of that player to your organization, and then how does that equate to the value of the picks? And I think you have to look at your individual situation too, in terms of where you're at as a team and what you're trying to build and the holes that you're trying to fill. But at the same time, if you feel like the value's there, you're going to do what you need to do to go get it.
With free agency looming and so many teams needing a starting quarterback, the timeline for you guys to make the decision on the route that you're going to go to get your quarterback gets sped up. So are you prepared, I guess, evaluation-wise, that you'll have to make that determination here by mid-March?
Yeah, from an evaluation standpoint, when you're talking specifically about pro free agency, yeah, we are. There's a lot of pro free agency is a little bit different than the draft. The draft, the players there, you have the draft pick, you select them. You're not negotiating a contract or going through those mechanics to get a deal done. And so, but from a straight evaluation standpoint, yeah, we've put in a lot of work through that process. We've evaluated the quarterbacks that are in pro free agency. We understand what that market is. We have a hierarchy of what that looks like, in our building, and yeah, we're prepared to execute that plan, with the caveat being there's a contract element and a cost element involved in that, and so we don't know what those prices are. Do you know what I mean? That's not you don't really know that until the free agency period begins, and so you have to have a level of fluidity to it. Because you don't know necessarily what that price tag is going to be for an individual player, or that player could sign with another team. And so I'd say if you go in there with just plan A, you could be scrambling if you don't have a multi-step plan in that situation.
At the Senior Bowl, you mentioned that obviously you guys need to improve at all three levels of the defense.
Yeah.
And because of your situation, you guys don't really have all that many players under contract on defense, so it's almost a blank slate, not completely. Is your preference to build, sort of the traditional front to back in terms of prioritizing the defensive line first, or are you more of a secondary boost that up and build up?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that I've always been in a belief when you're talking about the defensive side of the football of I'd say building it inside out. I think having a strong defensive line sets the tone for the rest of the defense. Now, that doesn't mean, you can find a good player that you draft a good player. We talked about drafting the best available players, but I think having a deep defensive line that can disrupt, that you can run in waves and things of that nature. And, we have a lot of work to do to get to that point. But if I was going to kind of lean one way, I would say that would be, where I would start from a building standpoint.
Andre James, and I know he's under contract, but would you like to rework that deal in order to him to stay, or are you happy where he is, money?
Yeah, I think that with Andre in particular, we spent the last year with him and got to know him and got to see him play. And there's a lot of good things about Andre as a person and as a leader that we really like. And I think he improved as a football player this year. I would say we're not to that point yet. Just with where we're at from a roster standpoint, we mentioned how many UFAs that we have this year, how many expiring contracts that we need to work on. And so I'm glad he's under contract. I can take a breath because he's there. But we have just kind of a major order of business with this current group to handle before kind of get to that step. But really excited about what he did this year at the same time.
Josh had mentioned that you and Josh Jacobs' representation have been in dialogue. Any characterization on where that might be, and any feeling of it could get done before the deadline for the free agent or the franchise tag?
Yeah, I would say it's still very fluid. Those conversations have. We've had a few of them, getting everybody's ideas on the table. We'll continue to work through that process this week. You never know. I mean, I've been involved in deals that I thought were going to take 2 months, and they got done in 2 days. And I've had the experience of doing deals that I thought were going to get done quickly that don't. And so, there's a deadline coming up, and from in terms of applying the tag. March 7th, I believe, is the date, and so we understand what that deadline is, and we're going to continue to work that process this week. So I can't put like a specific thing, a specific time on it, or I'd say like a gut feeling on what it's going to be or not going to be. Just irresponsible. I've been done this too many times to know that would kind of you paint yourself in a corner that way. But I'd say the commonality is that we want Josh to be a Raider, and that Josh wants to be a Raider. And so that's a really good place to start. And, hopefully we'll work to get some common ground here sooner than later.
Is it a question of either tag or contract, or is that too simple to say it that way?
Well, both things are on the table. Right. Yeah, I don't think that we've made up our mind and just said like on either way, on either side, but like, hey, we're not, if it's a tag, then forget it. You know what I mean? Or making the decision that we're not going to do the tag. I think that both of those opportunities are on the table. They should be on the table, and again, we'll see how it plays out. But I'd say it could go either way in terms of how it gets executed.
Because of the way most of your contracts are structured, next year's books are pretty clean. I think right now, I mean, it's an estimate because we don't know the cap.
Sure.
It's like over $100 million. Is that something that is intentional to sort of keep that kind of open in terms of planning for future moves, or is it just kind of happened that way?
Well, some of that happened before we, the results of things that happened before we got here. So I'm not going to take full responsibility for that. But I would say that, the intentionality is of, and this isn't going to happen every time, is doing deals that, not having a plethora of deals that end up putting you tight against the cap, like having cap flexibility, having a healthy cap growth, or having a healthy cap situation. I think we like the flexibility that gives us, to be able to not only, it's not always about re-signing or signing a player that's out there, but re-signing your own players in particular, which we've talked about wanting to, really kind of grow that continuity within our organization. And so I think philosophically, we would always like to kind of operate with some healthy cap and not kind of, be tight against it. I've worked in those situations, and that's hard because you end up making decisions on your roster sometimes during the season, week to week, that are predicated by the cap. Even to the point of like, hey, we're not going to elevate this player this week because of the cap situation, or you're constantly restructuring guys during the year. So there's a bit of, I'd say, intentionality on our part, that we want to have that flexibility as we go through kind of each individual year.
Is it your intention to be aggressive in free agency? I mean, do you have a long list of guys you're like, yeah, I think we can add these people, or is it still too early to make that decision?
I think that you can develop your philosophy before free agency starts. Now, sometimes that plan doesn't work out just based on how the market materializes and things of that nature. We're always going to have a group of players, I would say, in free agency that you just know based on what the market is and what conversations are. If you want to get that player, you're going to have to do that in the first couple days of free agency. And then there's going to be another pool of players that you're going to make the decision on, like this position group or this player, whatever it may be. We're going to wait. We're going to sit and wait and see how the market materializes. And I think that is predicated on maybe the depth of that position. That may be predicated on what the draft is, the surplus and demand in the draft at that certain position is. So I think there's a few different variables that go into making that decision. But there's situations where there's probably, I think, unless you're planning on sitting free agency out, and you just go in with that mindset, there's always going to be a player or two that that if you're going to do a deal, you're going to have to do that in the front side of free agency. And there'll be some players like that this year also.
Is Jared Stidham still, is that in the picture, kind of a guy and bringing back?
Yeah, it's in the picture. Like anything, those conversations are fluid, and he's not under contract at this point. And so, we're happy with what he did, and he's a player, obviously, that because of his experience in the system, there's value in that. And so we'll look at that market, and there's a lot of players in that market, this year that we're going to have to, that we've evaluated, that going to be a part of that equation too. And so we'll see how it ends up working out. But ultimately, we'd like Jarrett to be a Raider going forward, and just have to see how it fits together.
The 2 games that he played, did that open up your eyes any, or kind of validate what you felt he was capable of doing?
Well, I think anytime, we had never seen him play a live football game. And so anytime you get to see someone where the bullets are really flying, playing against top tier competition on the other side of the ball, there's value in seeing that. And so there was value in seeing that with Jarrett. And we've always thought Jarrett was, a good football player, that he had the potential to play well. Seeing it, yes, it provides more validation. There's less question marks. Now it's a 2-game sample. We also were 0-2 in those 2 games. And so while, yes, there's some validation to it, I'd still say there's still a lot of questions to answer on that position because the sample size is so small.
Do you ever feel like there's pressure or maybe even an anxiousness to make sure that you're hitting the draft right, so you're not having to rely on free agency to try to build the team?
Yeah, it's a healthy pressure, and it's a healthy kind of anxiousness. I mean, it's part of like the juice of like the fun of being in personnel. But to your specific question, yeah, we want to improve our homegrown talent. That's something that hasn't, materialized here over the years. And, it shows you it's a difficult process. There's no guarantees to it. But I think, we feel like, we have an opportunity this year with the amount of picks that we do have, with where we're picking, that we have an opportunity this year to build that core group of players. That doesn't always mean that you have 12 superstars and 12 starters. Some of those guys are working class individuals that, provide depth to your team too. But yes, there's a healthy excitement, a healthy anxiousness and anxiety to we have that opportunity in front of us and go capitalize on it.
Do you feel like there's a number of starters that you need to pull out of the draft, or is it kind of fluid each year?
I think it's fluid. I think it's fluid on where your team is, and I think it's hard to say, like, to put that expectation on a player to say we're drafting these guys and we need these 4 guys to start. Do you want to hit starters in the draft? Yes. I don't really put I want them all to be starters. But I don't really go in there and put a specific number on it. We plan to come out of the draft with some guys that are starters for the Raiders for a long time. I would say that.
This
Time
time
for a couple more guys.
Yeah, this time last year, probably in a little bit of scramble mode, just kind of coming aboard. Can you quantify where you are this year compared to last year? Being ahead of the game for the draft and for off season.
Yeah, we're a lot farther along. We just, we had that time, if you remember, like I was on the job a little bit over a year. They had already done their free agency process. They had went through, they graded all the free agents. They had graded them on the scale that they were using. They graded them in the system that they were scouting for. And so we are in the opposite end of that spectrum this year. And so that provides a lot more clarity for us, a lot more clarity for the scouts as they went through the fall of knowing what we were looking for. There was a lot less learning, even though there's still a lot of learning going on. The scouts last year were learning the grading scale and how to interpret it, and they're trying to evaluate the player, and they're trying to evaluate the player for this new system in a very condensed amount of time. And so a lot farther along in those regards. And then the draft, I would say the same thing. It's the same dichotomy. They were evaluating under a different scale for a different system. And so we're a lot farther along. Does that guarantee better results? You would hope it does, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case. But we're confident that the continuity that we've had, the amount of learning that's taken place over the last year, the group of talented scouts that we have in the system, that it's going to pay a positive result for us.
Dave, I was talking to Josh about this. Fans don't want to hear it. They think it's an excuse. But prior to your arrival, their drafting has been an epic failure, especially in the first round. As a GM, how frustrating is that when you got a roster where there hasn't been guys that you've done the homegrown and you didn't have the depth? How hard was that to deal with?
Yeah, well, I think what the situation is. You evaluate the situation before you take one of these jobs, and so what the landscape is and what's missing and what needs to be built. And the reality is that going back to the homegrown piece of the homegrown talent, the situation is what it is, and so now we have to figure out the solutions for it. And the solution is drafting well, and so I wouldn't say frustration or any of those types of things. Like, again, we knew what we were getting into. We knew what the task at hand was, and we've developed a plan to hopefully make decisions that is going to improve the homegrown talent and boost that young core of players that we need, and that's what we're prepared to do.
Is there a position that you think is really deep in this draft? Are you looking forward to talking to some of these guys?
Yeah, and I probably, I have some more digging to do. I would say just a couple of the positions on the surface that look like there's some depth to it. On the defensive side of the ball, the cornerback position looks like there's some healthy depth there throughout the position. The tight end position's unique this year. I think this is probably one of the deeper tight end classes that I've seen maybe since I've been in the league. Again, on the surface, but there's quite a few players there. So I'd say those are the two positions that, on the surface looks like there's a good amount of depth at.
You guys all set? Oh. Is there any scenario where you got, regardless of round, where you leave this draft without drafting a quarterback?
Gosh, well, I never like to talk in absolutes. I think there always could that happen? Yes, it could happen. Do I see that happening? No, I don't see that happening. I think every year, we've talked about it philosophically, and I think, Ron Wolf had a philosophy in Green Bay that almost every draft they wanted to come out in some form or fashion with a quarterback prospect. And I'm not going to tie myself to that because I don't think it, again, you do an absolute and then it doesn't go that doesn't happen, and then that doesn't work out well for you. But I would say some form or fashion we're always looking at the quarterbacks, and whether it's we had Chase Garbers last year in free agency after the college free agency after the draft. But I think we want to always continue to add to that position, and I think we'll be this year will be no different.
All right, thank you guys.